what evil lurks in the hearts of men. The shadow knows.
With the radio show and pulps enjoying colossal success, it only figures that films and other medias like comic would inevitably follow. And thus the Shadow's first foray into comic books would be in the form of a comic strip in 1940, published courtesy of the Ledger Syndicate. Writing duties once more fell to Walter Gibson, and the series was drawn by Vernon Green. However, it would sadly last only a little more than a year before being axed due to paper shortages. But this little setback didn't prevent the Dark Avenger from eventually getting his own proper series. Funnily enough, though, Gibson was actually against the idea and demanded royalties from whoever decided to take on board the writing duties. And so, to keep the proverbial pennies in check, Stree and Smith decided to let the magician journalist write it. Gibson agreed, and soon, teaming up once more with Green, began working on the comic series alongside his pulp work. Interestingly, this was actually the first series to blend both shadows from the pulps and from the radio show. And of course, a combination means invisibility powers, and in order to overcome this little hurdle when it came to drawing the shadow, Green used blue inks to create a strange ethereal effect on the page. As for his ventures into cinema, the Shadow starred in 2 films, The Shadow Strikes and International Crime, both starring Rode LaRocque as the titular Master of Darkness. Towards the end of the 1930s, though, both were average crime movies that weren't exactly the take-off success that the pulps and radio were. Following this, in 1940, The Shadow would be adapted into a very successful serial starring Victor Jury this time, and sees the Master of Darkness battling a mysterious criminal mastermind known as the Black Tiger. In spite of some changes from the source material, such as Lamont Cranston being a chemist instead of a millionaire playboy, the serial is considered one of the better adaptations of The Shadow. However, all success must come to an end eventually, and for all his amazing skills and powers, even the Shadow could not escape this. In 1946, during disputes with Stree and Smith, Walter Gibson left, and instead the Shadow was handed over to a mystery novelist writer, Bruce Elliott. Unfortunately, these stories were not up to par with Gibson's material, and were denounced and panned by Shadow fans, accused of watering down the character to little more than a glorified private detective, as well as accusations of repetition, and being little more than throwaway pot-boil mysteries, as opposed to the more adventurous stories of the Gibson years. Finally, Stree and Smith came to their senses and fired Elliott, bringing Gibson back, who alas only got to write a few more novels before the series was finally cancelled in 1949, though these stories are considered a welcome return to form and some of the best Shadow stories in a long time. Luckily for fans, this would not be the end of the Shadow's adventures in print. The pulps would be reprinted in new editions many, many times over the years, and Gibson himself got to write 3 more books, one of which led to a spin-off series written by Dennis Lind, though once again it strayed far from the character, taking a more spy-oriented angle, with elements of science fiction. And just to cap off this particular era in the Shadow's history, the final note is the remaining movies produced by Monogram Pictures, which were nothing more than glorified B-movies starring Kane Richmond. By the turn of the 50s, the Shadow had seemingly run his course, as the radio show was coming to an end and the pulps were long gone. However, 2 efforts to turn him into a series for the new medium of television were attempted in 1954 and 1958, though both were unsuccessful, and the latter in fact got redistributed as a film twice, first under its original title, The Invisible Avenger, and subsequently as Bourbon Street Shadows. And then came the swinging 60s, and this time Archie Comics, best known today for series like Sonic, would try their hand at reviving the Dark Avenger. And while in the beginning it seemed like they were staying relatively close to the radio incarnation, eventually this series would stray far, even going so far as to dump the Shadow's traditional black garb for a skin-tight spandex blue and green suit, as well as giving him crazy gadgets like a weakness gun, no doubt cashing in on the big spy craze at the time. Fans cried foul and the series was quickly cancelled. However, all hope was not yet lost, as in 1975, issue 1 of DC's The Shadow hit. Written by Dennis O'Neil, one of the men who helped resurrect Batman and bring him back to his dark roots, and drawn by Mike Kaluta, who had become the artist most associated with the Shadow. And the first couple of issues went on to become a hit, with many fans, then and now, still considering it one of the best adaptations of the character, praising it for returning to the roots of Gibson's pulps, with no invisibility powers, no silly gadgets, just the guns, his brain power, the agents, and the saying of the 1930s. Simple as that. And though Kaluta himself had gone on record as saying that when he first read a Shadow story it wasn't exactly his cup of tea, his nebulous, flowing, and ethereal work would perfectly complement the dark tone of O'Neill's writing. But sadly this dream partnership would not last long, as after issue 5, Frank Robbins replaced Mike Kaluta for artist duties, and fans quickly cried foul, criticizing Robbins' work as being far inferior to that of Kaluta and deeming it as stickish and cartoony. And though another artist, E.R. Cruz, would be brought in to try and return the series artistically back towards a more Kaluta vein, and even though O'Neill's writing had remained of consistent quality throughout, the series was axed after 12 issues. And Dennis O'Neil himself laments the loss of what was for him a very different and unique writing assignment. And then the 80s came, and with it would come several major events. The first and most tragic was the death of Walter Gibson in 1985, ironically with a new Shadow novel still in his typewriter. And alas, what was to come next would do little to improve the mood of the fans. In 1986, Howard Chaykin, a writer and artist at DC who had worked on other 30s throwbacks, was hired to do a new Shadow series. And while at first glance he seemed to have been the perfect choice, Chaykin made no secret of his dislike for the Dark Avenger, and would very much turn the mythology on its head when he wrote the 4-part miniseries The Shadow, Blood and Judgment, which would see the Shadow updated to the present times, or the present times of the 1980s as it were, in a story that would see him solve the murder of his old agents by a madman with a vendetta against the Shadow. Gone was the sanctum, gone was the Shadow's firm grasp on justice, gone was the Master of Darkness, and instead came in a violent and darkly comic approach. Here he was recast as a bullet-happy vigilante, more in the vein of heroes like the Punisher, his automatics being substituted for Uzi machine guns. Despite fan outrage, the series sold surprisingly well, and though Chaykin would depart, the editor of Blood and Judgment, Andy Helfer, was brought in to write the new series, continuing off from where Chaykin had left. Join me for part 3, where we will examine how Helfer fared, as well as looking at what would happen to the Shadow throughout the 90s and his present standing as of this video. See you there.